has pared away the things that we thought were mental about the mind and assigned it to the physical. And in a sense, the issue of consciousness, the question of consciousness, is all that's left in the mind versus brain battle. Okay? So the threat to consciousness is the threat to mind itself as a distinct entity, mind as mind, rather than mind as some physical product. So let's talk about physicalism, which is at root the premise that the mind just is the brain. Okay? Here are the premises of physicalism. Only physical forces and states are causative. All aspects of mind are the result of underlying physical processes. And there isn't anything in the universe that isn't a consequence of matter or energy or some combination of the two. And if there was something that was not a consequence of matter or energy, it wouldn't matter at all to the physical universe. It would be irrelevant to it. That's for you, those of you who like very long words with lots of syllables. That's called the epiphenomenalism. That's the premise there. Okay. So, according to physicalism, mind, and therefore by extension consciousness, is physical and only physical. Okay, this poses some problems for us. Okay, first off, death survival. If everything about human nature is only physical, then forget about death survival. There's no substance to that. And this is why you run into, when you talk to mainstream scientists and skeptics, who are very much subscribers to the physicalist thesis, that's why they dismiss the idea of death survival or any of these kind of things. Is because if physicalism is true, then you don't survive death. Nor are there any spiritual components to the universe, any sorts of spiritual experiences, at least in the terms that it's traditionally been regarded as that. All religious claims are bankrupt, except those that deal only with sociology or psychology. Okay? And, perhaps most importantly, free will is then succumbs to determinism and indeterminism. If physicalism is true, there's a growing consensus, you lose free will in any robust sense of that term. So you can see these are pretty major implications for individually and for society at large. So if physicalism is true, it will change things dramatically. It already has started to do that. Okay, however, excuse me, consciousness itself is used as an argument against physicalism. It sounds a little bit circular, right? Physicalism is trying to prove that consciousness is physical, but consciousness itself is using to rebut that argument. Okay, it's not as circular as it sounds, but it is actually in vain, as I'll explain here. Okay, a number of interesting arguments and thought experiments have been used to try and show that consciousness is not physical, at least in any sense that the physicalists would like it to be. I'm not going to explain all these arguments, we don't have enough time, but there are many interesting ones, and they're very colorfully entitled. You've got Mary the color scientist, the knowledge argument. I already talked about what it is like to be a bat. There's the zombie argument, and there's the inverted spectrum argument. And perhaps in the Q&A or sometime after, if you're not familiar with these arguments, I can touch on them for you for a minute. But all of these are used to show, through various clever argumentation methods, that consciousness is non-physical, okay, or at least that it's an argument against physicalism. Unfortunately, they don't succeed, and I'll explain why. Physicalism strikes back. In order to understand how it strikes back, let's talk about how we establish the truth of physicalism in the first place. First of all, physicalism is proved by inductive evidence, okay, leading to what's known as inference to the best explanation. Physicalism is not a deduced proposition. It is not proved like math, like a math problem. It is proved, and in fact you can throw out the word prove, because really when you get right down to it, science doesn't deal in proof. Science deals in preponderance of evidence. And so the better your evidence, the more likely your theory is to be true. And that's basically how physicalism is established. Okay, so it involves enumerative induction. So if you have one crow, and then you find another crow, and they're black, and you find another crow, and it's black, and then you find another crow, and it's black, eventually you conclude that any crow you're going to encounter is black, right? That's completely familiar to all right? And how this argument works out with physicalism and science in general is that anytime we encounter a phenomenon that we think is supernatural, when we investigate it very thoroughly, we discover that there are physical explanations that are far better than any supernatural explanations. So, for example, we have this view that disease is caused by evil demons that enter a person's body, and then the witch doctor comes and shakes his rattle and blows some smoke, and it chases the demons out, and the person is cured. But if you get a stubborn demon, they die, okay? So all bets are off. The witch doctor does his best, okay? Well, then later on, the germ theory comes along and discovers that no, diseases are caused by these little tiny things that get into the body, and there are these things you can do to combat those germs. And in fact, your cure rate goes up dramatically. That's evidence, very strong evidence, that the evil demon's supernatural hypothesis is false, and that you have a physical explanation that works very well, okay? So you have this hypothesis that angels are pushing the planets around, and that's what causes the movement of the planets. Well, later on, Copernicus and Kepler and Newton come along, and we discover that, no, you can explain the movement of the planets by very plausible physical mechanisms. We don't need angels anymore, okay? So you've established two cases where a physical explanation is far better than a supernatural explanation. And after you've done dozens of those and hundreds and thousands of those, you come to the conclusion, through inference to the best explanation, that anytime you encounter a supernatural explanation for a phenomenon that happens here in the physical world, there's probably going to be a physical explanation for it, so you can forget the supernatural explanation. That's kind of how it works. Okay, everybody clear on that? Okay, so you get induction and you get inference to the best explanation. I couldn't resist putting in this word in parentheses, abduction. It's not what you're thinking, okay? Abduction actually refers to the logical principle of inference to the best explanation, among other things, of course, but that's what it means here. Okay, so because physicalism is proved by inductive evidence through empirical research, right, logical and deductive arguments can't disprove it. And so oftentimes people launch philosophical arguments against physicalism, and they just don't go anywhere because they don't get at what actually grounds physicalism. The only way to deal with, how do you fight physicalism? The only way to do that is with a counterexample, so-called white crow. Everybody's heard this term. Everybody thinks it came from, well, the different people think it comes from different people, but as far as I can tell, it originated with William James. He's the one that first used the term white crow, and he was referring to refuting an enumerative induction. The only way to do it is with a counterexample, okay? So here we have all these crows, and they're all black. Well, what happens if we find a white crow? Well, we disproved our induction. But it doesn't work quite so easily that way. In modern science, one white crow isn't enough. Real quick, why isn't one white crow enough? Huh? Replication, right? It could be an accident. Maybe that crow flew through a radiation stream, or whatever, and got mutated. Who knows, right? You got to have more than one white crow in science to establish whether or not an induction is falsified or not, okay? So the unfortunate thing is sources of white crows have dried up. With every time you disprove a supernatural hypothesis, you have disproved, now I'm using supernatural very glibly here, a non-physical hypothesis, if you will, then you have lost one of your white crows. Which is why the qualia, what it's like, knowledge arguments, why all the arguments from consciousness don't work, is because although, well, let's see, I guess this is where I can talk about this. They don't work because they're inconclusive. We don't know what makes that what it's like feeling when we experience the color red. We don't know. Neuroscience hasn't figured that out. It may never figure it out. But the fact is, because we also can't prove that it is non-physical, we can't prove that neuroscience will never figure it out, it's inconclusive. And an inconclusive argument, it's like the baseball rule, tie goes to the runner. If you have an inconclusive argument, inference of the best explanation throws the argument to the physicalists. Because they've won so many times in the past, the odds are high that we will find, at least by their assessment, the odds are very high that we will find an explanation within the physical domain for what it's like, the qualia experiences, whatever, in consciousness. At least that's the thinking. And as long as you have no other white crows, the physicalists win, just by default. Okay? However,